So the world is a mess. That's clear. When you think about China and what their aspirations were to displace the U.S. from its perch as kind of the leading nation, I don't think they envisioned things going the way they're going right now. And I have to wonder if President Xi is thinking that he might be losing control of the world he envisioned. When you think about his partners in this disorderly process of upending the U.S. and really the governing institutions after World War II, he's relying on Putin. He's relying on the regime in Iran. He's relying on North Korea. It's not exactly the most dependable group of people that you can know that they'll stick with you through thick and thin. And at the same time, he was hoping to use the Chinese economic model as an alternative to the US model. And that's under some pressure because of some of their issues as well. So we're in a very different world today. And it is not as, I don't think the transition is going in the direction that President Xi would have wanted it to. And it's certainly not going in the direction most of us would want it to be going as well. Sorry, let me just put this squared away here. So let's get into it. So today I want to talk about the disorder, touch on the conflict and what the potential outcomes might be in terms of the economic impact, and then talk about the risks and opportunities that we're seeing today. So, when you think about it, we have the war in Europe for the first time since World War II, and that is being, looks like it continues to be drawn out. I believe that it would be ideal for Russia if they could continue to extend the war for a while, because I think it's putting strains on the support for Ukraine. You think about the tensions in the South China Sea, you think about the disruptions that we have in the Chinese economy. You think about the political dysfunction in DC that we actually can't govern right now because we don't have a Speaker of the House. And then you think about the inflation issues, the economic issues, and all the elections that are going on that are creating a lot of change. And it's been a tough time to be an incumbent. You're seeing a lot of those guys getting bounced in the elections, and swings to the left and the right are becoming much more common from shifts that we're seeing going on. And all this is leading to a bit of a slower growth and a downshift in growth. The IMF just lowered forecasts. As you can see, pre-pandemic average for global growth was around 3.8%. They're looking at 2.9% for next year. You can see the downgrades in some areas. The US stronger, in France, Japan stronger this year, but really only the US and Brazil and South Africa showing positive changes from their previous forecast in April. So the global economy is clearly not going in the direction everyone would have hoped. But the growth is more resilient than a lot of people would have expected. And if you're out at any of the stores I was happened to be at a Marshall's the other day, I couldn't believe the lines there. And it was right next to a Home Depot. You couldn't get a parking space in the lot there. So I think consumers are still active, but they're changing their spending behaviors. And I think that's because inflation, while it's come down, is still a bit of a challenge in the system. As you can see here, if it's pink, it's below 5%, and the darker red it gets, the higher it's getting, up to 60% plus inflation. But overall, in the major economies, it has come down. I guess the fear is that you're going to see some resurgence in energy and food costs, and labor costs are moving up. Housing is an issue globally, but it has taken some pressure off the system that we're getting closer to a gradual easing, getting back closer to the targets that the central banks have had. But you can see that the changes have been pretty significant, and the orange line is what the forecasts were for the path for central bank policy. The blue line is the current path, and you can see a shift up in the rate expectations for next year. That's the higher for longer. I think this is reflective certainly in the US of tighter conditions. And the messaging from the Fed right now is quite interesting. They're not talking about more rate increases or maybe one more rate increase, but they've shifted the discussion from rates to tightening. And the reason for that is something we've talked about here. Tightening is much more than just the absolute level of rates, and they have had a 500 basis point move in rates on the federal fund side to create tightening. The long end has come up where the bond market's doing some of the work for them, creating tightening conditions on the long end. You add to that they're reducing the balance sheet, and the shift was they were putting 125 billion a month into the system. Now they're taking out 95 billion a month. So that's another tightening condition as the Fed's balance sheet comes down. You have mortgage rates doubling, and then you have the bank lending standards getting tighter. All these things are creating tighter conditions against a consumer that is reducing their excess savings. And while they're dealing with higher costs of living, so while inflation's coming down, their cost of living remains elevated. And that creates a problem for most consumers in that they don't have the discretionary spend that they had before, and therefore they're going to have to make different choices. And while you're doing that against a highly indebted system with rates pushing up and interest costs crowding out other spends, one of the big challenges for the system today is that fiscal policy can't carry the ball the way it did for the last 10 years. And it really is up to the central banks. And that is why they're going to be a little bit more hesitant on reducing rates until they're comfortable that inflation is getting closer to their target. Not that we expect it to get to their target, but to get closer to the 2% level. So I think this discussion about tightening is an important one to understand the nuanced difference between rates moving up and the financial conditions still making it difficult to grow the economy because you're not having the access to credit. So let's shift to the tragedy in the Middle East and the terrible timing of what's going on there. And this is from Bloomberg Economics. They've laid out 3 scenarios of how the conflict could evolve. Hamlet has joined the call. He's much more of an expert on what's going on in the Middle East than I'll ever be. But I just want to share what Bloomberg Economics has laid out. 3 scenarios where it's confined really to the West, to the Israel and Palestinian territories. It spills over to Lebanon, and then it becomes a real full-blown conflict in the Middle East with Iran and Israel and everyone else getting involved. I think this is the range of outcomes is really what the world's dealing with right now. I think we've taken a very complacent approach in the global markets where they're viewing this as like all the past conflicts that tend to be more short-lived. I'm not sure that's the case. I suspect it's going to be at least the second one, if not getting worse. And it really depends on the course of action that's going to be taken by the Israelis. But I think there's bigger forces at play here, and it particularly goes back to the potential pact between the Saudis and Israel. I think that the stability that was being fostered through some of these arrangements was upsetting to certainly to Iran and maybe to other actors in the region like Russia that is concerned about it. So I think there's a lot of a range of outcomes, but I don't think the confined war is going to be the likely one, but I hope it is, but I suspect that there's more forces at play here. The impact that they estimated at Bloomberg Economics on growth, they're showing the far left is the baseline of global growth, and then it starts to slide down, as you can see. And I think if we get to the direct war one, all bets are off. I think that blows up to where you're really looking at a 3-front global conflict with Russia, the Middle East, and the South China Sea potentially all blowing at the same time. I think one of the issues that works against this, and we have to keep an eye on, is China's economy, and how does China see this? Is it in their favor if things get more chaotic, or do they need to rein it in? and stabilize things because they're not in a great spot economically for what's going on, even though this would create big vulnerabilities for the US. They did come up with an economic impact. I think this is interesting, but that's all it is. I don't think you can take anything to the bank, but clearly they think a big shift in oil prices ranging from $8 to much higher levels if we get into a direct war. It's important to note that Iran is producing 700,000 barrels a day more this year because of some of the easing of tensions with them in the US. That could reverse pretty quickly if the US tries to pull them back out of the market. So I think you can see some big swings in oil prices here. As I mentioned, the VIX, the market's taken this in a very complacent way so far, but I think underlying you could see big moves in the markets if depending on which way the conflict evolves. At the beginning of the year, we looked at the World Economic Forum did a report on the risks in the system for the next 2 and 10 years, and cost of living was high on the list, natural disasters and weather, and geoeconomic confrontation. Lower down was really the issues around war, but I think that's certainly moved up to the fore. But one of the things that's coming out of this that is going to be a big problem, and it's I think a potential major problem for Europe politically, is the immigration or the migration crisis that comes out of conflict like we have seen in the past and we'll see now. And you're seeing the challenges of the displaced coming pretty fast. I think that has big political implications and social implications that we're going to have to watch out for. Before the attacks, Jay Powell said there were 5 big risks. He was talking for the US, really the workers, the labor costs going up for one, the government shutdown, which looks more real without a House Speaker, the resumption of student loan payments, the interest rates being higher for longer, and the impact of oil rise. I think he's got to rethink right now of what the Hamas attacks mean and how that changes the outlook for capital flows. Ironically, it's again doing part of the work for the Fed, where it's actually attracted a lot of capital to the US and has produced some moderation in the interest rates. It's also flattened out the curve some. I think for ARS, where our concerns are is fiscal policy being at its limits and putting all the burden right now on the central banks to deal with the problems of the world, which they're not in a great spot to do that with, given how much they've laid out before and the moves they've already made. So the central banks are really going to have to let some of the markets play out right now because they don't want to fuel inflation by cutting rates too quickly. I think the other issue, when you see the migration crisis that I believe is coming on top of the existing one, and you think about the concerns of a lot of the European countries and the discussions of return to austerity policies, you're going to have immigration and austerity going against slowing growth. That's a tough scenario, particularly when you need to be investing in productivity growth enhancements and doing the things to modernize the economies. So I think that's a challenge. I worry about weakening military support for Ukraine. And now I'm even more worried when we start to have the US and NATO nations starting to split their resources to multiple areas. So a growing conflict in the Middle East certainly helps Russia with their efforts by taking bullets and dollars away from support from Ukraine. And I think if we prolong it long enough and end into a conflict that is a negotiated settlement, that is actually just the setup for further Russia expansion at a later date. Fortunately, we were concerned about the demand for treasuries, but that's being absorbed in the markets. Commercial property and debt blowups are big issues that we still worry about in this environment. And we're not out of the woods yet in either one of those areas. We favor a number of areas that we've liked all along. So obviously tech is still going to be an important place, but it's becoming more integrated into every other industry. And it's those companies and industries that are going to be able to make the productivity improvements as fast as they can in this environment. They're going to win. We still favor the energy companies, materials, healthcare, and strong balance sheet companies. Consumer discretionary and staples are among the worst performing areas this year. We think they will likely remain that way. We are underweight the banks. We do like some financials, but we're not wild about the setup for banks right now, or telecoms, because the amount they have to invest right now. And I think you really want to look at high multiple companies with questionable growth to avoid, and low multiple highly indebted companies that aren't growing fast enough. They'll not be able to compete with the winners in this environment. And I think the important thing to keep in mind for a lot of portfolios is you need to be well represented in the areas that most aren't well represented in right now, whether it's materials, energy, or industrials. And just to give you a sense of the weighting of our flagship strategy against the market, this is how we complement other strategies. But what I would say is the materials area is going to continue to be a geopolitical and economic issue for security and securing the scarce resources that are necessary for all the tech changes we're making. The energy transition, we're getting just a wake-up call on that. And then the industrials, it's really about two elements: owning the defense companies that you need to own at a weight that is material, and you need to own them before the changes start to happen there. Aerospace and defense is only a 2%, 2.8% weighting in the S&P. So you really want to be well overweighted, and you want to be there before problems start. And then you want to own the industrial companies that are going to benefit from the industrial and military policies that are becoming so prominent in the system today. So I'm going to stop there, Mark, open it up for commentary, and then we can bring Hamlet in for his views, however you want to do it.
Yeah, let's do a few questions broader, and we're lucky to have Hamlet to talk geopolitical and security and technology related. So questions on the comments? And Andrew and Duncan, your hands went up at the same time, but because we haven't heard from Duncan in a while, I'm gonna let Duncan go first.
Okay, thanks. Two sort of observations, and I wonder if you could comment. I don't know if you saw this article. I think it was the Wall Street Journal today, and it was really talking about, it was an article about the rules of war and how it's really not working, you know, prosecuting war crimes and that sort of thing. And, you know, this crisis is really bringing up this, you know, the businesses with the hostages and all this. I mean, I think people are going to have to revisit the rules of war and solve that problem. And the second thing that's sort of tied to that is, you know, we've got this sort of unwritten rule is that you don't kill leaders of states if they're bad guys, because you need somebody to negotiate with. If you really look at the problems we've got here, both in the Ukraine and in the Middle East, you know, it's not 8 billion people that are causing the problem, right? I mean, there is a minority of people that are causing all the problems right now. And I just wonder, you know, and then I'm sorry to speak so long, but there's one other thing. I think it's kind of tied to it, right? If you look at what's going on with the House of Representatives right now, I mean, if somehow this guy Jordan gets in, I mean, we're going to spend less money. You know, it's, you know, there's kind of like a rethinking to me in sort of how the country gets run and the process is done, and then in how we deal with wars. I mean, they're big picture themes, but I just wonder if you could comment on that and think if we'll actually see some change.
I think we've been, I think our adversaries in the autocratic states have been trying to upend the rules, the post-World War II rules, for a while now. And the idea was to get them more balanced, away from the West, to be more balanced. But I think that I think we're probably seeing it go too far. And I think the US has pulled back from, stated a desire to pull back from its global leadership role for a while, certainly under the Trump administration. And that created a void that other people decided to step into. And I think that weakened the rules of some of the post-World War II governing institutions that needed to evolve that didn't. So I think it's part of an evolution that we got to a point where the world changed and the governing institutions really didn't, and it was leaving people frustrated, and that's pushing some change there. I do think that we've gone to a very different world where the old rules don't matter anymore. And, you know, when you're dealing with terrorists, the terrorists don't fight with conventional rules. Hamlet can speak to that much better, but their rule book isn't the rule book of the rest of the world. They're not governing states in a sense, they're terrorists. So I think I would leave it at that. I think I'll just leave it at that, Duncan.
And what about the new House Speaker, if elected, would be spending
Yeah,
less?
on the speaker, I think they're gonna have a tough time governing anyway. And I think a lot of it will depend on the Republicans not wanting to be viewed as the ones who pushed us into a major shutdown and cut too much of the spending at a time that the world got a lot sloppier. So I think our pulling our defense spending down right now is going to be a lot harder than people would like to think. Hamlet, I'd welcome your views on that.
As soon as
Yeah, no,
soon as you turn Hamlin on, you know it's going to turn. It's going to be the Hamlet show.
I'm okay.
I know, but just Andrew, is your question relating to any of this?
I was gonna do a quick one back to Stephen's presentation and leave Hamlet to discuss all the stuff that just came
Okay.
up.
Okay, just
Sure.
hold the
Just-
horses for a moment. And by the way, let me hit. Someone's got to move to the airport. Riyadi came into Raleigh from Singapore. He has to go look after his Charlotte real estate investment. So just want to say hi.
Yes, hi, hello. Very pleased to meet everyone. Such a beautiful day here. Yeah,
Yeah, it's actually warmed up in the last half
it is.
hour.
It's really, really beautiful.
All right. So
Great.
good to see you.
Thanks. Good to see you. Yeah,
Couple of-
it's
All right, Andrew.
see you.
Just super quick is the budget's gonna go out of control because of debt service. We discussed that. The last auctions went great because it's relative, because rates in Japan are 0 and nobody wants to trust Europe or China. So Stephen, I think that part you got. The question I had was, you said fiscal policy is at its limits. And what does that mean?
You're hearing it. The Republicans don't want to spend anymore. We need to get the budget under. Joe Manchin was on that early this year. That we don't have the ability to keep increasing the debt the way we've been doing it with fiscal policy that's not giving you a return on your investment the way you need to. And we just put in, $7 trillion over the last couple of years of additional fiscal spending. So we need to have that stuff work and create productivity before we can add more onto it, because we're already at the limits on where we are to debt to GDP, where we are with net interest costs, and we have all the other unfunded liabilities that we have. So we really can't keep building and building on it. So it really is going to be up to the Fed to do a bailout if we have a recession. They're not going to be able to do another $1 trillion spend. They'll not that they won't try, but
Yeah.
reasonably
Yeah.
we're at our end there.
Perfect, makes sense, and I want to leave time for Hamlet because I have a hunch it's going to go a long time.
All right.
So over to you, Hamlet.
yeah, I'll keep it short and sweet.
Can you introduce yourself for those who don't know you?
Yeah, Hamlet Yusuf. I run a venture fund called Iron Gate. We invest in national security and defense related technologies. Strong ties inside government, primarily the intelligence community and the DoD. We are a bunch of shameless capitalists, so we want to make as much money as we can for our investors. But when we structured this thesis 4 years ago, we were pretty early saying that the world was getting into a second Cold War, if not a third World War. And our near peer adversaries and our threats were going to be China, Iran, Russia, not just the issues of terrorism that were emanating from the Afghan and the Iraq wars, which were waning. I think it was about a year ago on one of these calls. I said that the Ukraine invasion by Putin should not be viewed in a vacuum. This is going to be a series of tectonic shifts geopolitically. The first act was the Ukraine invasion. The second act would be the emergence of belligerence of Iran as it relates to them becoming a nuclear state. And then the third would be China's aggression on the geopolitical stage. And I think we're living through Act 2 right now. Act 3 is anyone's guess in terms of when timing is going to come. And I think Stephen made some great points. China has its own systemic issues that they're dealing with, which I think in many cases could fuel their aggression on the geopolitical stage. So to me, there's no coincidence that this happened when it did. I don't think Hamas woke up on the 7th and realized it was Putin's birthday and as a gift decided to unleash the horrors that they did on Israel. To a certain extent, I think this was either somewhat planned, coordinated, or known. A lot of folks benefit from this action, namely Putin, as well as the Iranians. Kind of hard to break this down into very linear fashion, but bear with me here. I do think this is going to escalate significantly in terms of conflict. I think the triggers we got to look for right now is what happens to the north, primarily with Hezbollah. It's the reason why the U.S. has deployed 1 up to 2 carrier groups and more resources into the region. That's to project strength to primarily Hezbollah and Iran, letting them know that this is going to be Israel's fight with Gaza. And at this point, Hezbollah and Iran should stand down. If they don't, then there's repercussions to be had there. Going back to my comments on Putin, Putin really wins at this point because now the world has another conflict to wave flags around and say who they stand with and where we want to dedicate resources to. You already starting to see constituencies on the right saying that we should cut off aid to Ukraine and start diverting those funds to Israel and to fight Hamas and potentially cripple the Iranians. Well, this gives now Vlad the opportunity to, I think, increase his aggression in Ukraine, and I think with his near-term goal being with a war-weary West, hope to get to some point of appeasement where there's some sort of a stand down or a ceasefire, and he basically gets to sit on and hold the lands that he stole in Crimea and Donbass. That's not going to be the end of the conflict. That's going to give Putin a chance there to rearm, reassess, and figure out what he wants to do next, which in my opinion is a continued march and expansion of Russian territory to look like what he had in the Soviet days. This puts into light some of the other tensions we're seeing in the region. You have an emergence again along religious lines, the conflict between Kosovo and Serbia. Those scores are now being, or those issues are now being brought back to light. You have the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. And again, any one of these in its vacuum look like individual flare-ups. So I think there's a lot of interconnectivity there. If you look at the Armenia-Azeri conflict, that's been a ceasefire now for 20 plus years. But the reason this has flared up again is Armenia has been protected by the Russians since the fall of the Soviet Union. About 2 years ago, Armenia elected a new leadership, which was for the first time, to put it kindly, anti-Moscow. They wanted to pivot away from Moscow and be more pro-Western, pro-Europe. That angered Putin a year and a half ago. The Azeris were involved, actually almost 2 years ago, the Azeris were in a conflict with the Armenians where they inflicted a significant amount of damage to Armenian infrastructure that was provided by Russia. Russia and Putin needs Turkey as an ally. The Azeris and Turks are Turkic states. So I think it's been a trade where Russia gets Armenia. In return, Azerbaijan gets Nagorno-Karabakh, which is the region they've reclaimed for the Armenians. I would not be surprised if at some point you don't see the Azeris to make a push on Nakhchivan and basically take away the small band that connects Armenia to Iran. The geopolitical implications here is the West and Russia are both Putin, Turkey in their sway. They're kind of caught in the middle in terms of which way they will go. The Armenians have nothing to offer as a counter. And what Putin gets to his south is a Christian vassal state that he gets to control, because I think he's worried about some issues domestically and internally as well. Going on to Turkey, Turkey is at a bit of a crossroads. I think you have elements within Turkey that represent, lack of a better word, the Turkish deep state that are industrialists, military and energy related families and entities that are probably more prone to the Ataturk reforms and want to stay closer to Europe. And you have the Ankara camp that wants to probably go back right or back more conservative, whether it's a reemergence of a caliphate state or they want to be more closely aligned with Russia or China. That's going to be, I think, a key issue. So if things continue to devolve in Israel, which I think they will, and I think it's a matter of time, not if, Hezbollah becomes active in this war, those dominoes begin to fall. Turkey then will, I think, become an issue there as well. So going back to the three scenarios that Stephen highlighted from Bloomberg, I think all three are definitely in the realm of possibilities for sure. Near-term escalation in Gaza is here. The question is, does and when Syria and Hezbollah become involved in this fight, and what does that do to Iran? If Iran does get involved in the fight, I just don't see a scenario where the Iranians and the Saudis and the rest of the Arab world stays on the same side of the fight. I think that bar fight will get pretty violent pretty quickly. The issue at hand here goes beyond just Gaza. It goes beyond just Israel. To me, I look at coincidences in geopolitics to understand why. This happened at a very unique time. It happened about a year and a half before we get into our presidential election, or actually a year before our presidential election. It happened at a time where the Iranians were just given $6 billion in relief and assets that were unfrozen in Qatar. It happened at a time where the Iranians were given back five prisoners that were here in the U.S. Guilty of sanctions violations and providing material support to Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile program. And it happened at a time where I think Iran was coming dangerously close to negotiating some sort of an agreement with the West in terms of their nuclear deal. To me, this is happening, I think, as an act. One possible scenario is Iran wants to create and churn the conflict here in the Middle East, because if we're focused on Ukraine and we're consumed on Gaza and Hezbollah and the Middle East and Syria and whatnot, that consumes resources and takes them away from taking any kind of potential military action against Iran should Iran become a nuclear state. I think the fear is there that Iran has become dangerously close to becoming a nuclear state. If that happens, that completely, I think, rejiggers geopolitics in the region and takes us down a very, very tenuous path. Quietly sitting in the wings, I think, is China. Again, I don't think this happened overnight. I don't think this is a series of coincidences that are happening as happenstance. I think there's opportunistic intent here. I think China views themselves as the geopolitical superpower of the future. They want to be the only one in charge. They're of the philosophy that this concept of independent democracies and self-rule has failed over the last 300 years, and the world needs to go back to what China views as the model of the future, which is strong centralized command, where Beijing is in charge, and a handful of centers throughout the world beholden to Beijing call the shots. I think they want to see a weakened West. I think they want to see a weakened Europe. Conflict in Ukraine and success by Putin achieves that. I think Iran's rise in the Middle East helps create a sense of destabilization, where they can potentially one day come in as an arbiter of peace and win influence in the region and become a key point of influence for the globe. They want to replace the West. That all sounds very nice on paper, but I think what's happening here is people are underestimating the issues and challenges that China faces domestically. I think if you look at China, they have some significant issues from a demographic standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, from an economic standpoint. The fact that you're looking at massive migration of jobs out of China, that's going to put some significant pressures on them at home. The first two acts that I talked about, again, like I said, were the invasion of Ukraine and the emergence of Iran in the Middle East. The third will be Chinese aggression, although I'm more concerned about physical aggression or proxy aggression, China via Pakistan against the Indians, or potentially Chinese conflict along the Indian steppe. Taiwan is something everyone's concerned about. As of right now, I don't see China making a move on Taiwan. I think Taiwan is something they want to see fall along the lines of Hong Kong, which was a slow strangulation. But all bets are off if things continue to evolve inside China and Xi is faced with some sort of internal unrest or internal resistance against the party. You have 1.3 billion Chinese wake up one day and realize that the 200,000 people that represent them don't, and they're the issue and they're the problem. That is when I think all bets are off, and Xi could become more assertive and more aggressive in the South China Sea. So it's hard to predict kind of what the next set of dominoes are going to fall, but I think that's the world we're faced with right now. I put out a series of write-ups that talks about this. Other folks that have talked about the same kind of dynamic. If you guys aren't following Peter Zeihan, you should. George Friedman as well talks a lot about this as well. And I think it was a Joe that posted a note about the fourth turning. These are all, I think, elements and concepts that describe what's happening. I think in the near term, the next 5 to 10 years, we're in for a hell of a lot of chop. I think the world is now going to have to decide what kind of future do we want? Do we want a future that's being led by a handful of power centers, or do we want to continue with this concept of independent democracies rising and choosing their own faith? And that same argument applies here domestically as we start talking about what kind of politics we want to rule our world. Oddly enough, not to get too far into U.S. politics, that kind of mindset is why I think if you look at 2024, the Bernie voter in some aspects is going to turn out and vote for someone like a Trump, because this becomes an established anti-establishment vote. So we're going through some interesting times. I'm not very bullish on the long-term health and vitality of China. I think Europe has some issues, but I think we come out of this pretty strong. I think you have the potential formation of a supercontinent or a superpower between America, Canada, and Mexico. So shared a lot. There's a bunch of places we can take this, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Great.
Thanks,
Hamlet. Thank you.
Adam's got his hand up. Or Stephen, did you want to make a comment?
I
for Adam?
did want to just, the scenarios that Hamlet just raised lead to a couple of things. That's going to be the continued global fragmentation, which means we're really going to create a dual economies where you're going to have along the allies where you're going to be working with like-minded and trusted, or as trusted partners as you can get in the global system, which means everything's going to cost more, and industrial and military policies like the US and China have will become more prevalent. I think you'll see that becoming a bigger part of the discussion in Europe. I also think the timing is for these aggressions is one that the US and the West is at a particularly weak time where we've run down our armaments considerably, and we can't fight three fronts at once. Right now, we've been at war for a long time and don't have the munitions that we need. So we would all have to be gearing up in the West. You would have to move to almost a wartime policy to be able to fight three battles, if we could even do it.
On the munitions front, there's speculation that we hit our dead low reserves in terms of large scale munitions sometime in the spring. So if you want to talk about a holy trinity of shit show, you have chaos in U.S. geopolitics. Yep. You have Trump getting the nomination. You have Biden running into some sort of health issues. You have removal of the vice president for somebody else. You have RFK's ascension, and you have a complete mess in the U.S. If there's ever a time where all the bad actors are going to move against us at the same time in some sort of coordinated fashion, spring, summer of next year would sure seem like that. That's when it would take place.
And Hezbollah has rockets that they could be launching 5,000 rockets a day for years. Is that right, Hamlet? So that they could be sucking a lot of U.S. weapons for basically kind of just for show and weaken us even more. Is that one of the concerns I'm reading about?
Well, it goes beyond just rockets. I mean, rockets is 20th century tech. Look at what's happening in Ukraine. Look what Hamas did in the run up to the invasion. You get a couple $100 worth of drones, yep, and attach an ordnance or a semtech to it, or a piece of ordnance to it. You can do massive damage on the battlefield.
So, right, Mark, I guess the areas that it's going to create problems in energy, problem in defense, and problems with materials, yep, and sourcing. So it's going to lead to, I think, a little bit more inflationary pressures on the system when you're running a much less global system, efficient global system, when you're running dual setups.
And of course, you showed your non-correlated overweights there. Yep. Adam, question.
Yes, Stephen Hamlet, thank you very much. Making my morning here. Great summary, Hamlet. Really liked it. my question, Hamlet, for you, two questions.
Mhm.
If this war does escalate, where Iran gets into the game with Hezbollah, with the current civil unrest that is going on in Iran,
Mhm.
what, I mean, that would be a challenge in mobilizing that Iranian army to fight, I think.
So
You're
Adam,
a
maybe
good judge of that.
maybe the couple that is it if they are shown to have a tie or they escalate. I mean, Israel's been very clear they're going to shut down energy production, the source of income.
Yep.
Doesn't that force the issue that Adam could be talking about?
And my second question, Hamlet.
He's got 5 questions. Get ready.
I'm writing them down.
The difference between Hamas and Hezbollah, Hamas being Sunni, Hezbollah being Shia, much
Mhm.
closer to Iran. The coordination, why, if this was orchestrated and coordinated by Iran, why wouldn't that attack be simultaneous? That's my second question.
Yeah.
Second
can-
last
can-
question, Adam. Any more questions?
That's Well, I have a lot more, but that's for
Yeah.
another time.
Okay.
Look, a simultaneous attack versus a delayed 1-2 punch is a kind of a normal decision when it comes to military tactics. If you want to play the high road and make it look like you're non-involved, then I'm going to set the fire of Hamas and Hezbollah, and then what I want to do at that point is I want to gauge what Western resolve is going to be. I think there's all sorts of debate in terms of Putin's antics in Ukraine, but the one thing that I think everyone would categorically agree upon is he completely mismanaged and underestimated and read wrong what the global response was going to be to his invasion of Ukraine. I could see this as a scenario where where the Iranians are giving their nod to Hezbollah, I'm sorry, to Hamas to do their deed in Israel, and then from there judge the West resolve and see what we do in terms of categoric response for Israel. And I think they're watching what we do with politicians, regardless of left or right side of the aisle. Don't look at their comments, look at their actions. Biden is now, I think, planning a trip to Israel this week. We've deployed massive show of force into the Mediterranean. So our resolve and our messaging to Iran for sure is saying, don't you dare cross the line. And Biden, in his 3 sentences of coherence, told on the 60 Minutes interview, don't you dare. Well, I guarantee you the Iranians will dare, because they've seen this foreign policy team. The foreign policy team behind Biden is the same foreign policy team that had red lines that were erasable with Iran and in Syria. So I think they are going to test to see what that resolve looks like, and based on the reaction of that, I think you'll see what happens in that kind of pathway to escalation. In terms of the Iranian people, what's been fascinating to watch is if you follow me on LinkedIn, there's been a ton of videos that I've posted outside and inside Iran, where the Iranian people are protesting Hamas and Hezbollah. They are not pro-regime, and the reason is in 1979 and 1980, as well as in 2009, whenever there was major upheavals inside Iran, a key force of people that were on the ground beating the shit out of the average Iranian weren't other Iranians. They were Hezbollah, they were Palestinians, there were Syrian Arabs who were coming in there and acting as the enforcing goons for the regime. So the people don't have any kind of love for the cause, so to speak. So, look, I think Iran can make a massive miscalculation here, just like Putin did. And then as a result, I think it's going to cause tremendous pressure internally. I think you have an axis of authoritarianism that's formed here between Iran, Putin, and China. And I think all 3 of these misfits are ripe for defeat and fall. And I think as one falls, the others will fall as well. So as dark and as bad things are now, I think there is a bright future ahead. But we're going to go through some serious conflict before we get there.
Emily, you just brought up a really fascinating point is that, there is a increased discussions both here and in Europe about pulling back on spending and pulling back on support for Ukraine. And your take would be one fight is all fights, right? You
Yeah.
can't pull back on one. It's just it will embolden Putin if we pull back in there, and it'll embolden the other two if you pull back in any one of those three theaters.
Yeah, look, I think I'm of the opinion that we're in a second Cold War, if not a third World War. I don't think this third World War will be like the first and the second, where you have columns of tanks duking it out on the front line. I think what you're going to see is a series of regional proxy conflicts and wars backed by kind of the key stakeholders. And I do think the future of warfare is changing, and we kind of saw this coming, and that's why we invest where we do. But autonomous systems, robotics, drones, counter-drone technologies, cyber attacks, cyber warfare, offensive, defensively, space wars, disinformation campaigns, information warfare. Those are all going to be key elements and tenets of what is to come. And I think that conflict will sort itself out. And I hate to be a pessimist and an optimist as well, but if you look at the kind of the history of the world, whenever things have gotten bad from a geopolitical and more importantly from an economic standpoint, we've had these flare-ups. We've had them 3 times now in the last 120 years. So I think we're about to go through that same kind of rough patch here.
So, and Andrew Voss.
Thanks, Hamlet and Stephen, as usual. Hamlet, it wasn't too long ago that North Korea went through a span of time and a concentrated period of firing off a lot of rockets, test firing a lot of rockets. Where do they fit in this whole scenario?
Yeah, I'm the least worried about North Korea, and here's why. The guy's a 30-something-year-old fat pudgy deity. In his country, he's viewed as the grandson of God. He was educated in Switzerland. He knows what the world is like, and he knows he's not a deity or God. But as long as he doesn't mess things up, he gets to rule this little kingdom of his and do whatever the hell he wants. All he's got to do is listen to the Chinese, but not piss off the Americans of the West to the extent where we would come in and take action. And I think that's what he's going to go ahead and do. This kind of same mindset applies, I think, to Iran, and the issue around a nuclear agreement with the Iranian regime. The issue with Iran is going to become a nuclear state in our lifetime, probably within the next 10 years. There's no stopping that. They've already proven the scientific capability and know-how on how to enrich uranium to get to nuclear grade. So for those of you guys who aren't familiar with how nuclear or how uranium is enriched, put it very crassly, you dump a bunch of uranium in a bowl, you spin the bowl really fast, it separates, it enriches. You do this over a series of cascades, and you get to pure uranium. To get to the point where you're enriching for medical or energy grade or research grade uranium, you need to enrich to about I think the mid-teen to mid-20%. You enrich to 90% plus if you want to go to weapons grade. Iran has already proven the capability of going to 60% plus, which means all they need is time and resources to be able to get to 90%. We can't go in there tomorrow and bomb their facilities. They've stuck them under hospitals, buildings, schools, deep inside mountains. They've split it up. So it would take a series of one-way missions, multiple sorties, and international cooperation to do that. So that's becoming a very difficult issue. And going back to my comments earlier, I think Iran is potentially creating this distraction to give them the space they need to become a full nuclear state. The issue with nuclear is there's 2 small power centers that control Iran currently, and one is absolutely in charge. The people that want the Islamic Republic to remain want it to remain purely for ideological reasons. That means they're actual true believers in the Shia faith, and they want the Islamic Republic to last. That makes up maybe 10% of the overall population. Another 10%, I think, wants the Islamic Republic to remain because they may have come from the cloth, but they're absolutely corrupt. They're clerics, they're part of the military-industrial complex, or potentially part of the IRGC, but they know that they run a 75 million person economy based on fossil fuels. The issue there is the clerics are in charge. The clerics, a good portion of them come from the Mahdi sect of Shia Islam. The Mahdi sect of Shia Islam holds the ideology that one day the hidden Imam, the 12th Imam that disappeared 900 some odd years ago, reappears with Jesus Christ as a savior and brings about their version of revelations, brings about their version of end times, brings about their opportunity to exact revenge on the house of Sunni. This is almost analogous to like the ultra conservative revelationist hardcore Christians in the US. The end times are here, so to speak. That's not the person that I want to have access to nuclear weapons. That's who is now in charge inside Iran. There is a turf war brewing inside Iran where those two power centers are fighting. I don't like the corrupt kleptocracy in the IRGC military industrial complex, but if those guys end up becoming in power and they end up becoming nuclear power, we have less to worry about. Because if you're an absolute corrupt kleptocracy and you care about your Bentleys and your houses in Dubai and London and everywhere else, guess what you don't want? You don't want nuclear war and conflict. So that's manageable. At that point, if you start opening up the West to Iran, you have the chance of letting the absolute corruptive powers of capitalism, Western free markets, modernizing and normalizing relationships with Iran. So I guess that's my long-winded answer of I'm not as concerned with North Korea, but also how that applies to the Iranian nuclear issue.
Hamlet, how do you see the Saudi-Israeli deal that was getting closer to being, and how do the other players in the Middle East, what's the trigger for whether they go against Israel or and join with Iran or not? How do
Again,
playing out?
Watch what they do versus what they say. So everyone is now lining up to quote unquote condemn Israel, but if they're not supporting Hamas or Hezbollah or dedicating any kind of resources, then I think that's more lip service than anything else. Again, timing is everything. I don't think it's just happened in a vacuum. From an Iran perspective, the Emiratis and the Gulf states had already began rapprochements with Israel. For the first time after Khashoggi's killing, the House of Assad and the Israelis recognized each other in press statements. And the concept of rapprochements and mutual kind of cooperation with Saudi Arabia and Israel seemed imminent. That scares the shit out of Iran, because if you have peace and stability between those nations, you now are singularly sidelined and kind of just left and isolated. So I think they benefit by trying to create division there. The question is going to be, does anyone really care and understand what's happening there? And do they want to back Hamas and Hezbollah? Or do they want to support some sort of a transition where you do have a removal of Hezbollah, or actually not Hezbollah, excuse me, a removal of Hamas and establishment of some sort of detente between Israel and Hamas? Because what's interesting right now, unless I missed something here, all the action we've seen happen in the last week has not been between the greater Palestinian movement and Israel. It's been focused around Gaza and Hamas. There is no love lost between the people that rule the West Bank and Hamas. There's almost like a rivalry there. So is there a future where the Middle East kind of sits back and ring fences the region and gives Israel the nod to go in there and take care of Hamas, and we're left with something that hopefully puts us onto a path of a two-state solution and peace? If that happens, Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas all lose, because at that point the cause is deflated to a certain extent.
I wonder if that goes back to Duncan's question about taking of the hostages to make it more difficult for Israel to make a good choice.
I have a darker opinion there. I think the hostages for sure is one piece. But again, yeah, full bias. I was born in Iran. We fled that country in 1980, so I have a unique set of biases against that country and that regime. But when you reward a country over and over again in negotiation by giving them a ton of cash, which we did in JCPOA, and we just did again in September, and you give them their hostages, which we did back in 2015 under Obama, and we did again in September, and you give them a nuclear deal, which we did in 2016, and we're marching towards that again, you almost incentivize them to continue with that action. So if I'm Israel, if I'm Iran, and out of the 200 some odd hostages that were taken by Hamas, you got 27 to 30 some odd Americans. Well, guess what becomes a really interesting negotiating ploy if I'm the Iranians? I am now going to come in. I'm going to go ahead and help stabilize the situation. I'm going to help negotiate some sort of an accord where the American hostages are released along with some sort of a plan to give the Israeli hostages back. What I'm going to negotiate back with Biden is some sort of a guarantees or some sort of compromises or concessions that help advance my nuclear agenda. That's the fearful future of where this thing goes near term. And then that flips the conflict, because now you go from an Israeli Hamas Hezbollah conflict potentially back to the conflict everyone wants to avoid, which is a Sunni Shia conflict with a nuclear undertone.
Thank you.
Andrew Voss.
Quick follow-up. Hamlet, in your mind, how high is the correlation between what's happening from a macro perspective globally and perceived weakness in the United States?
Again, not to get into politics, but after 2020, I've been very vocal saying that we're going into a period where this is 1976 and 1980 all over again. In that span, you saw more countries fall to communism than ever before. And you saw the emergence of the Islamic Republic and the real aggressive emergence of political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood. Same thing can be said here between 2020 and 2024, where our adversaries are looking at weak and uncoordinated leadership across the West and saying, okay, this is our chance. This is our chance to take as much turf and do as much damage as we can, because we don't know who's going to be in power 18 months from now, whether it's the current administration or it's going to be a replacement on the left side of the aisle, or it's going to be somebody on the right side of the aisle. So I think you're seeing that happen. Again, no correlation, or sorry, to me, there's no coincidences in complex geopolitics. So when I go back to that 3-act tragedy that I talked about, that culminates with China asserting themselves because they know this is their opportunity to move.
So, Joe.
Hamlet, this is just brilliant. Do you have any perspective on the intelligence failure around Gaza and the potential for it being a wag the dog sort of event for Netanyahu, given his legal troubles with corruption at all?
Yeah, you can argue both ways. You can argue that this was a wag the dog to distract in terms of the issues that Netanyahu's facing. You can also say this is meant to make Netanyahu look weak, so he can come back and enact some sort of a regime change or change in leadership down the road. I think the answer to this is probably a lot simpler. Having gone back and looked at what the intelligence failures looked like around 9/11. The day after 9/11, to be able to put the pieces together wasn't that hard. How do we not see this coming? Everything was right in front of us. We just weren't paying attention to it. Same thing here. I think when you look at it, it's like, okay, how do we not see this coming? I think as the Israelis go back and do their after action report, they're going to see clear telltale signs that they should have acted on and did not. Now, whether that's through political reasons, whether that's because they're distracted elsewhere, is it because they're distracted on other issues, to put it mildly? That could be the case, because if you look at Israel has been struggling with last several years some of the same things that the U.S. is going through here, which is this cultural divide of I don't want to say wokeism, but not having the military and the security construct focus on what they should be focusing on. And if that's the case, I could see where intelligence failure could have happened, where you weren't putting the pieces together and you weren't doing what you're supposed to be doing. I fear we're going to see some of those same mistakes here in the U.S. because are we as a national security construct focusing on the things we need to be focusing on, or are we paying attention to things that we shouldn't be?
Other comments, questions?
Hamlet, thanks for joining today. That was great.
Yeah.
We only asked Hamlet yesterday as we were exchanging emails on something, and he was great to join in and give such wonderful insight. Really, really good. Thank you.
Yeah, I put my email in the chat, and I'm also pretty vocal on LinkedIn. So more than happy to stay connected. But look, I think this is to put a positive spin on all this. I do think that the future is exceptionally bright if we make the right choices and the right decisions. I do think that the world today is going to be demonstrably different 5 to 10 years from now. If you go back to the 1890s, back then people looked around and like, you know what, horse and powered buggies and oil powered lamp is not the future. Inside one generation, we went from that to the flying machine, modern computing, landing rockets on the moon, satellites, and just the dawn of the nuclear age. In that period, we went through 2 world wars, a depression, and a pandemic, and potentially a third Cold War. And what drove that change was technology, was innovation. And I think we're about to see that same thing where technology and innovation is going to completely disrupt the world. In that 60-year span, you had the rise of the American superpower. You had the collapse of the British global empire. You had the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. You had the complete balkanization of the Middle East, and you have the complete balkanization of Eastern Europe. The world looked demonstrably different. You had the emergence of the CCP and Chinese Communist Party. So massive, massive tectonic shifts. We're about to go through that same kind of disruption, but instead of 60 years, it's going to be probably 5 to 10. So think about the ramifications of that. But at the same time, as allocators and investors, the way the world functions is going to change demonstrably. And if you're liquid and nimble and can navigate those rough waters, I think there's a lot of opportunities ahead. And I think private capital is going to be a key driver of that.